The Washington Post reported recently that a 39-year-old father committed suicide in a Rio Grande City jail last month, one day after his 3-year-old son was stripped out of his arms. Public defenders in McAllen, Texas, told the Boston Globe that mothers are being told their children are being bathed and will be returned shortly, which turned out to be false. It was simply an excuse to remove the children from their mothers. Miriam and her 18-month-old son fled violence in Honduras to seek asylum in our country. Upon arriving in February, immigration officials forced her to give up her son, who was driven away crying. She was not allowed to comfort him and hasn't seen him in 4 months. That's an ACLU court filing. Another mother and her 2 sons, aged 10 and 4, fled violence in El Salvador. After being apprehended, the family was given 5 minutes before the crying boys were taken from their mother. She's been held in Laredo Detention Center for 3 months and doesn't know where her children are. A third mother and her 7-year-old daughter fled ethnic violence and potential civil war in the Congo. The mother described hearing her daughter screaming in the next room when they were separated after arriving in the United States. She was detained in Otay Mesa, and her daughter was sent to Chicago, thousands of miles away. They were separated for 4 months and spoke only a few times before being reunited in Chicago. This is not the United States that we know, and we're here to try to put a stop to it. Last month, Attorney General Sessions announced that all adults who arrive at the border, even those seeking asylum, would be prosecuted. From October of 2016 to February of 2018, 1,800 families were separated, about 100 per month. However, since then, Attorney General Sessions has announced had made that announcement. An average of 50 children per day are being taken from their parents. That's 658 children over 14 days in May alone. These numbers are really shocking, and they demonstrate, I think, the gravity of what families are facing. The administration is arguing that separations are required by law, but let me be clear, that's false. No law requires this action, and the Trump administration should reverse this policy today. Children are terrified, parents are heartbroken, and families are being destroyed. Our new bill would keep immigrant families together by preventing DHS from taking children from their parents at the border. The bill ensures children may only be separated from their parents in the event they're being trafficked or abused by their parents. I'd like to thank Congressman Jerry Nadler for introducing this legislation in the House, as well as the 32 co-sponsors in the Senate. We have 4 here today, in addition to myself, and I look forward to hearing from them. One last comment. This is really about our values as a country. It's who we are as a country. And we're here to say this is just simply wrong, and we've got to put an end to the taking of minor children from their parents at the border. With that, I'll give the order. Senator Durbin, Blumenthal, Merkley, and my freshman good friend from California, Senator Harris, and Senator Menendez, possibly.
I want to thank Senator Feinstein. Yesterday, I went to my Chicago office and met with one of the mothers that she just described. Her journey started in the Democratic Republic of Congo when the life of her daughter was threatened. In desperation, she grabbed her then 6-year-old daughter and headed for the only place she knew she could be safe, to the United States. Her journey took her first to Brazil, then through South America, then a bus ride across Mexico to the border near San Diego, where she presented herself and asked for asylum, holding her 6-year-old little girl. At that point, she gave a credible piece of evidence, and they said they would bring her into a hearing on her asylum status. They brought her into that hearing. She speaks very limited English, and at that point took her daughter away from her. She didn't know what happened to her daughter. She didn't know when she would see her again. Her daughter was then removed to Chicago, 2,000 miles away, and that's when I first heard about the case. They asked us about how this could happen. This woman had not been accused of any wrongdoing. Well, they finally gave her a hearing while her daughter was still in the child care facility in Chicago. But again, remember, limited English and no legal representation. They ruled against her on asylum, but said she had the right to appeal, and she asked, how long does that take? And they said 3 to 6 months, and she said, I can't be separated from my daughter for 3 to 6 months longer. I waive all of my rights. That was her status when she finally was released and allowed to be returned with her daughter. I met with her yesterday. They're trying to reopen her case and give her a chance to really tell her story with some legal representation there. It was a scene which I haven't seen in my office before. She's a frightened woman. She did not believe she would have this experience in the United States of America. She never let the daughter out of her sight the entire time we were together. The minute I walked into the room, this old white guy in his suit, you could see her tense up, wondering what was next for her in the United States of America. That is a story of the official policy of the Trump administration and Attorney General Jeff Sessions, to snatch children away from their mothers, to create pressure on them to leave, not to pursue any legal rights in the United States. There have been moments in the history of this country that have been sad, some embarrassing. We look back to our turning away those Jewish people who tried to come to the United States during the Holocaust. We look back as well to Japanese Americans interned during that war. Years afterwards, we realized what a terrible mistake we'd made. We issued our apologies to those who were affected and tried to be a better nation in the eyes of the world. And for decades we were, accepting refugees and showing a compassion when it came to people like this woman and her daughter from Africa. But now it is the official policy of Attorney General Jeff Sessions and Donald Trump to snatch children from mothers and to put the pressure on those mothers and parents so that they will just leave the United States and go back to dangerous situations. That is not who we are as Americans. It's not who we should be. If enough people in this country speak out, maybe we can change it. In the meantime, as we know it, hundreds and hundreds of these children are being separated from their parents. That's not American, and it's not right.
Thank you. Thank you to Senator Feinstein for this legislation, which, of course, should be unnecessary. It is necessary only because this administration is so lawless and because it has adopted an official immigration policy of family separation. Never did any of us think that the United States of America would make its official immigration policy to split and scatter families. There are really 3 elements here. Number 1, the purposeful and lawless cuts in the grounds for asylum seeking. Number 2, wanton cruelty as a means of deterring people from seeking asylum. And number 3, scattering children and ripping apart families. Hard to know which of these policies is more misguided, but all 3 are used now as official tools of immigration policy. These statistics are not only alarming, they are staggering. In 14 days in May, 658 children were separated from their parents, some never knowing where their parents are now, and no prospect of reunification. That's 658 children, is about 47 a day. Think of it in human terms, but also in the costs financially, and ultimately the costs in the whirlwind we will reap as a nation in the violence that will come from those children who are so traumatically damaged by this separation. The United States will reap a whirlwind in moral condemnation around the world, and ultimately in the violence that we have sown among those lives so grievously harmed. The traumatic effect of separation from parents can't be underestimated. And we know from the darkest days of our history how eventually the moral condemnation of the world has meant ultimately harm to our nation in the credibility and respect that we have around the world. Those days of Korematsu, of ships turned away at our borders, will always be remembered and condemned, not only by the world, but within our own country. And we should not repeat those dark days now. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Merkley, who has actually visited some of those sites.
Our Statue of Liberty carries a torch and the inscription, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free." But today, the effective message being sent is not that inscribed on the foundation of Lady Liberty. It's instead, should you flee persecution abroad and wash up on the shores of the United States of America, we will treat you as a criminal, and we will take your children away from you, and you may never see them again. Lady Liberty, under the Trump policy, is not carrying a torch. She's carrying a pair of handcuffs. This is such a dark and evil moment for our nation. I went down a week ago Sunday to see what was happening, to talk to the Border Patrol, and to attempt to visit a center where the children were being sent. At the Border Patrol Processing Center, I stood in a room with those large chain link fence cells that look like big cages, saw that group of boys segregated into one of them, getting in line from the shortest to the tallest. The shortest was just knee-high to a grasshopper, maybe 4 or 5 years old, on up through 16 or 17. And as I saw that line, I knew that some of them may have arrived as unaccompanied minors, but many others within the previous 24 hours had been torn out of their parents' arms, with them not sure if they'd see their parents again, and the parents not sure if they would see their child again. I asked the Border Patrol, how easy is it for the parents to get in contact with the children? They said, oh, it's very, very simple. No problem. We assign an A number. What's an A number? Alien number. We assign an A number, and we can just look it up and instantly find out where they're at. I said, well, I hear something completely different from those who actually work with refugees, that it's extremely difficult for parents to find their children, that there's 2 different computer systems, one in Homeland Security and one in the Office of Refugee Relocation. And they said, no, it's smoothly operating. I don't think that's true, and I think it's important that we have accurate information. I heard from an immigration lawyer who works with refugees, Harvard trained, very capable. She was going out to the no man's land between the Mexican side and the American side to take water. And she said she had been out there talking to families that had been kept on that bridge for 10 days or more in the heat of 100 degrees, or very hot heat in southern Texas. And I asked why that was. And she said it's to discourage people from crossing at the official point, so they'll give up and return to Mexico. She said if they do that, there's Mexican gangs, know they're vulnerable, they're really in a terrible spot, and if they return and then try to cross at the border somewhere else and take themselves up to the Border Patrol says, great, takes them in, now criminal, and indeed children separated. This child snatching has to end, and it has to end immediately. It is a dark scar on the heart of this administration and on the heart of our nation. I am introducing an additional act to accompany Senator Feinstein's Keep Families Together Act, which is just terrific, and I applaud her for that. But I'm introducing an additional act that just simply says members of Congress can actually gain access to the detention facilities. I tried to gain access. I was told you have to wait 2 weeks, and you might not be granted permission, which makes it functionally extremely difficult for a member of Congress to visit a detention center. Furthermore, we have to be able to see how these detention centers are operating on a day-to-day basis, not when a show is put on after 2 weeks of preparation. To keep secrecy surrounding this operation and the way children are treated, warehoused in a Walmart, former Walmart, is unacceptable. We have to be able to see what's going on. I was told today by the Commissioner for the Border Patrol that they are working hard to now bring in mental health professionals to assist. Do we not have them there now? I don't know the answer. I'm going to return. I think some of my colleagues want to return and see what's going on. And we need to make sure both that the child snatching ends and that when children are held, they receive every possible assistance. And so that's two missions we need to undertake. So thank you, Senator Feinstein, and thank you, colleagues, for being so fierce in this effort to defend children. And thanks to all of you for helping to shine a light on this policy the administration is trying to hide.
Thank you. Senator Harris?
Thank you. I want to thank Senator Feinstein for her leadership on this. Let's call this what it is. This is a human rights abuse that is being committed by the United States government. That's what this is. You can look consistently at what has been coming out of this administration in terms of its policy, in particular towards women and children. Let's just take a look. And these various pieces, if you think of them as the pieces, they paint a constellation that equals human rights abuses being committed by our government against these women and children. So DHS has separated at least 1,300 children from their parents at the border since October of 2017. They have not given us the data, giving us the reasons for it. They suggest that in some of those cases they're separating the children from their parents out of a concern that those children are being trafficked. Yet I've consistently been asking for over a year, give us the information then that shows us evidence of whether there was trafficking. None has been provided. Look at the policy where they have issued a directive allowing for more detentions of pregnant women. The previous policy was that there would be the least restrictive detention of pregnant women. This administration has changed that policy. And then look just recently this week where the Attorney General of the United States announced that asylum seekers who are fleeing domestic violence, and over 90% of those victims are women, or gang violence, would be turned away. And we happen to know that on the issue of fleeing gang violence, it is usually minors and sometimes children who are being brought by their parents to this place which should create safety for them and fleeing the murder capitals of the world. So what we see is an administration that is engaged in an ultimate act also of hypocrisy, pretending to care about families, when in fact, each one of these policies is specifically focused on separating families and resulting in trauma, not only the immoral act of what is being done in terms of separating these families, but also resulting in trauma to these children. The American physicians and the American Medical Association have talked specifically about the trauma in these specific situations and trauma to the parents. And most recently, we saw a father who committed suicide, apparently because of the trauma associated with having his 3-year-old ripped from his arms. There is something about what is happening in terms of these policies that has to call to question the morality of what is happening. There is something about these policies that has to point out that this is all supposedly in the name of border security. But in fact, what we have is a government that is ripping families apart instead of keeping them together. This is not reflective of who we are as a country, and it's got to stop. And I have been on the Homeland Security Committee of the United States Senate for almost 18 months. You can go back to at least April of 2017 when I asked then Secretary Kelly. After that, I asked Acting Secretary Duke. I have asked Secretary Nielsen, give us, as oversight body, information about policies that you have, training you're doing to create the least traumatic outcomes in terms of these separation policies. None have been provided. This administration has not only promulgated these policies, but they have provided no transparency and therefore no accountability to the United States Congress and, more importantly, the people of the United States. And this has got to stop. I applaud you, Senator Feinstein, for your work.
Thanks very much, Kamala. I don't know if anybody is interested, but if you are, ask me. There are 3 conditions only under which a child can be removed in the bill. Questions? Yes.
Not that one, but this was to Senator Harris. And I guess
Can you speak up a little?
Yeah, about what Senator Harris just mentioned on the lack of transparency. 2-part question. The administration has routinely claimed both that children are being trafficked in large numbers by people posing as their parents, but also that the increase in asylum claims is evidence of fraud in and of itself. Have they provided any evidence of any of that?
No. And the bill does provide 3 exceptions. And let me read the third. The third exception is the chief patrol agent or the area port director in their official and undelegated capacity authorizes separation on the recommendation by agent or officer based on a finding that the child is a victim of trafficking or is at significant risk of becoming a victim of trafficking. There is a strong likelihood that the adult is not the parent or the legal guardian. The child is in danger of abuse or neglect at the hands of the parents or legal guardian, or is in danger to themselves or others. Those are the...
Thank you. Quick follow-up on that. President Trump has described various dictators and human rights abusers in glowing terms. Do you think there's a connection between his rhetoric about some of these human rights abusers across the world and the policies the administration is implementing? Do you think that he sees this as a show of strength?
Well, I don't see a connection between what you're just saying and children being removed from their parents at the border. I don't know what President Trump is thinking about, but at the border, I just read you one of the 3 authorizations for a child to be removed, but we haven't seen them, and what's going on is wholesale removal. So that's what we want to stop.
Just to clarify, Senator, I meant in terms of attitude.
Whose attitude?
The administration's attitude, the president's attitude.
Well, I haven't discussed this personally with the president, but it's obvious from the attitude at the border of the taking of children without any criteria, just as a deterrent. It's my understanding that the Attorney General determined that this would be a deterrent, and therefore the policy was put into effect, and we want to stop it. Yes?
Yeah, it's related to this, but I wanted your thoughts on another policy change that the administration is weighing with regards to how it deals with unaccompanied minors released to sponsors. My understanding is that there's a policy change brewing where they're going to review or screen sponsors further, supposedly to avoid minors going into, human traffickers, but according to activists, the end effect will be that undocumented parents or sponsors will not come forth and claim those children. So I'm wondering if, you think that means that more children will end up in foster care, or what is the scenario of that?
The children always are movable targets. We have to get a basic bill through that says you cannot separate a child from his parent, and that's what we aim to do. And we have certain exceptions. They're on page 2 of the bill, and that's it. So if we can get this bill through, and it's a long way to Tipperary to get it through, then I think some of the other considerations can be taken. But we've got to walk before we run, and this is the basic article on which I believe we should proceed and has a chance of passing the Senate.
But Senator, there are already 5,000 children that end up in foster care because, the administration doesn't find sponsors to take them up, either because they're not qualified or they can't establish a family relationship. So that's already happening even before the policy change.
Well, yes. I don't know your number, but yes. And what's happening at the border is a real problem. What we're trying to do is solve these problems one by one by virtue of legislation that has a chance of getting through the United States Senate. And that's saying something because this is difficult territory. Anybody else want to say anything?
Well, I'll add to that is just that the Senator Feinstein's bill will address a lot of the underlying issues that are presented with the policies and the practices that you're describing. It's going to require DHS to be much more transparent and accountable about their policies and also about their training and about the protocols so that we can understand exactly what are the factors that they're considering when they separate these children from their families. Because right now, as far as I'm concerned, what they're doing is they're throwing out a bunch of red herrings. They're talking about trafficking, but yet they're supplying us with no information about any referrals to the Department of Justice for prosecution of trafficking. And you're spot on right. What they're also then doing with these fear tactics is that they're discouraging the families of these children, who are not the parents, from taking care of them after the child has been separated from the parent, because a lot of the family members are also undocumented. And they're afraid that if they come forward, they're going to be in the system also. And so there is obviously a plan this administration has to just reap fear in all of these immigrants. And as Senator Feinstein has said, apparently with the goal of creating a deterrence for immigration. But the process by which they're going about this is really inhumane.
Senator Feinstein, you said you aimed
You can call on any one of us. We're a team.
you say you aim to get this through. Do you have a single Republican on board or any indication of the Judiciary Committee hearing?
We do not, but we have a large number of Democrats.
Can I ask one more quick question on a related policy that the administration announced yesterday? Attorney General Jeff Sessions says the administration is no longer going to accept asylum claims based on domestic abuse. Does anybody care to weigh in on that?
Anybody want?
That change in policy is so hideous and noxious and a betrayal of American values to say that domestic abuse, which can include all kinds of basic human rights abuses, sometimes supported by government policy, will not be a grounds for asylum. It just betrays all of the traditions and values of America. And
That's right.
I said yesterday, I'll say it again, people will suffer brutality, and the blood will be on Jeff Sessions' hands.
I can tell you a story about this because I also went to a respite center on the border operated by a Catholic church, Sacred Heart Catholic Church. And there I met with a woman who had been released because she was many months pregnant. And she sat down and told me her story, that she came from Honduras, that her family tried to stand up to the local gang that ran that part of the city, that they sent a team of people to gang rape her, threaten her life, and she was gang raped. She fled for her life, had to make quick arrangements for her children, wasn't sure what condition they were in, and that she did not know the father of her child because the pregnancy came from the rape. Under Sessions' new policy, she would not have grounds for seeking asylum in the United States despite a well-founded fear of returning, which has been the standard, an assault and persecution followed by a well-founded fear. I think this is another effort to essentially completely change the vision of the United States as a nation that understands people fleeing persecution. Many of us have somewhere in our family histories, in some branch of the family, somebody who came to the United States from religious persecution or physical violence, persecution, civil war. We have always treated people with respect. It doesn't mean that between the time they arrive and their asylum hearing that they will win their asylum hearing. But it does mean we understand the challenge of persecution, the trauma of persecution, and we treat people graciously and respectfully. If the family stays together, it's much easier logistically for them to present their case before the hearing. And if they don't meet the test and they're the standard we have and they're deported together. But in either case, if they're granted asylum, that we haven't harmed them in the interim, and if they're deported, we haven't harmed them. But under this policy, we deliberately harm the children to deter or influence parents from coming to seek asylum. Deliberately harming children to influence parents is an evil and unacceptable policy, and it has to end.
Thank you very much. Good note to end on. Thank you, everybody.